Good middag. Tack för umidjan. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it really is an honor to be asked to contribute to this illustrious conference, even without speaking Swedish. I felt the vibrancy and the excitement of this morning, and I'm honored to be here with you this afternoon. We know from the excellent presentations, in fact, this morning, because I could understand a lot from the PowerPoint presentations, how important early life education is in terms of health and well-being in later life. What I want to focus on is the role of lifelong learning and how we can make interventions at the later stages in life to support long life learning. And one just early comment is that in preparing my presentation, I've already learned something from one of my postdoctoral researchers who is involved in inclusive design. And usually, I like to use these colors. I usually like to have a blue background for my slides and a yellow text. But she pointed out that from a visual point of view, and as older adults, one of the things that happens is people's eyesight may deteriorate, that in fact, it is preferable to use a white background with black text. So although it may not be as aesthetically pleasing to me, the reason I'm using this is I have been advised that it is actually more visually accessible. You can let me know later on if that's the case or not. So yes, of course, in Europe and internationally, we are facing major changes in our demography, and I just want to say a word about that briefly. And so amongst many complex interventions to promote greater equity and social inclusion, of course, we need to address issues of learning and opportunities for learning over the life course. And we want to bear in mind, and we need to bear in mind, important issues of equity of access as we do this. So these are the three areas that I briefly want to introduce. In terms of the changing demography, as has been pointed out several times very eloquently by eminent researchers this morning, our demography is changing not just in Europe, but globally, and it is changing rapidly. The blue line is the European pattern, the percentage of the population age 60 or over, projected to 2050, Joanna. The red line is for the whole world. So it is not just a North issue, it's a global issue. And the green line is for the Irish population trend. And I will just say a brief word about the population in Ireland, because in addition to our good music, poets, potatoes and whiskey, our demography has been slightly exceptional. We were a small population of just around 3 million in the Republic of Ireland in 1950. As many of you will know, that's down over 100% from a century earlier due to famine. And the population pyramid that you will be familiar with for most countries has changed over the decades to pretty well where we are now, with around 16% of the population aged over 60, but that's projected to change dramatically by the year 2050 with nearly 29%. Again, this is a pattern familiar with different lags in all of our different countries. I understand that Japanese demographers estimate that in Japan by the year 2000, in 1,000 years, with current demographic trends, there will be one Japanese person left. Unless, of course, things change. And one of the changes that we have is changing patterns of migration. Ireland traditionally was a country of emigration, a poor country. And that pattern continued in Ireland until we had a decade where we became a country of net immigration because of the economic prosperity, and now back to a nation of emigration again. So demography, of course, is changing. And maybe demographers have cried wolf in the past, but there are certain fixed points that we know are developing. And so the policy community is trying to address these challenges, and many of you will be familiar with something called the Dublin Declaration, involving the World Health Organizations, about the notion of age-friendly cities and communities, simply one response to these challenges. And the focus that I would like to have is on the intervention around lifelong learning. This is not a single panacea. It is simply one of many, many other interventions. And we know a lot from research, actually, about what works well in terms of lifelong learning. Please don't worry about the detail of this, but this is just an example from the findings from over 100 research projects in the United Kingdom about effective ways of learning and promoting learning throughout the life course. However, if we look again at the UK situation, a recent report, Learning Through Life, a national inquiry into lifelong learning, suggested breaking the adult life stages in our contemporary society into 4 broad age categories. And interestingly, I think these reflect some of the ones that were used earlier this morning. And in England, the rough proportion of the population in each of these categories is as follows. So around 20% of the population in 2010 were in the 50 years of age or older. But when we look at the investment in education and training by age group, and this inquiry provided detailed, very rigorous statistics behind this, including investment, public and private investment by age group per capita, the picture is extremely different. So again, don't worry too much about the figures, but when we put these two graphs together, what you're seeing is a very, very disproportionate underinvestment in learning support for adults, particularly in the over 50 age group. So we do have major equity gaps, because we do know that the more education people have in the initial stages, the more they will participate later on. And we know again from the excellent medical research we have the implications of education for health and well-being in later life. And so I just briefly like to draw attention to 5 equity gaps, 3 of which are very broad, major social and economic issues, but 2 of which are perhaps more in what we might think of on the supply side, and perhaps where it might be easier to make policy interventions. So those of you who'll be familiar with the Underground in London will know that we're asked there to mind the gap. And there are 5 equity gaps that I just briefly like to refer to. And the first is one I've already mentioned, which of course is around initial engagement in education and training. Without policy intervention, those of us who already have good levels of education will, as we get older, be more inclined to participate more in lifelong, long life learning. Those who had less will be less likely to, unless we intervene from a policy perspective. We also know, and we heard again this morning, the importance of social networks, cultural capital. And again, this is self-reinforcing. Those who have more gain more, and therefore have the richer experience in later life. And of course, all of these factors are interconnected with major socioeconomic factors and gender. And I've put gender in with socioeconomic because In the United Kingdom, for example, in the current recession, the position of older working class women with lower levels of education is deteriorating disproportionately to other sections of the population. So these are enormous social challenges that we face in trying to develop aging well policies. So there are two areas that then it seems I would suggest for discussion that perhaps we can try and make some interventions. One is in relation to our research activity. We've heard pleas from from national and international policies for the importance of aging research, and that this research should be interdisciplinary, drawing together medical research, demographic research, social research, economic research, educational research. And that's the great excitement from a conference like this. However, all research is not equal. And many of you will be familiar with the Future Age European project. Many of you will be involved with it. They have estimated that in terms of aging well, in other words, living a good quality of life as long as possible, that the combination of factors, and we can debate the relative balances, is roughly around 20% intrinsic. This is going back to genetics and the like, around 80% extrinsic, social, economic, environmental factors. But when we look at the proportionate investment in research, it's estimated that in fact it is the other way around, that the majority of research investment is in fact on the medical side, which is important, but leaving the very important social, economic and environmental factors under-researched. And the final area, which I would suggest is one where perhaps it is possible again for us to think of addressing gaps, but in a very strategic and practical way, which are around structural and institutional barriers. And here I'd like to briefly conclude with referring to some of my own particular area of work, which is around the potential role of higher education, institutions of higher education, universities, colleges, high schools and the like, what role we might play in addressing lifelong learning in support of long life learning well, because our universities and our colleges are major public resources in terms of education, direct lifelong learning, intergenerational learning and the like, in terms of research, I mentioned across a whole range of disciplines, and in terms of engagement. I think in Sweden you talk about the third mission or the third arm of higher education. So what's our responsibility in our universities, in our institutions, to engage with the communities such as yourselves in helping to fill some of these gaps? And in my own institution, Dublin City University, we're taking a very small step to try and do what we can as one small institution in this direction. This is the university's logo. 2 weeks ago, we launched this new initiative. We can talk later on about how we get logos, but earlier on we had a lot of discussion about having acorns and trees and pictures of old people, etc. And we decided to go for something that was just lively. And this age-friendly university initiative is something that has strategic support from our university president, that's our rector. The university has a track record. Already about 500 people come to our sports centre every week, working with our health and human performance colleagues to help them to develop fitness in later life. I've been chairing an interdisciplinary working group with all faculties represented on it. We've had extensive consultation and with the input of an external advisory board. we've developed an action plan and 10 principles of what for us an age-friendly university might look like. I won't go through these in detail, they're available on the PowerPoint, but essentially they're trying to, about ways in which, using the resources and the expertise we have as a public institution, how we can engage in different ways with the learning, the need to support learning in later life. We are trying to help people to learn throughout their life, and we're trying to engage with them. And if any of you happen to be in Dublin on the 9th of November, you're welcome to join me with the Irish Prime Minister when we actually launch our Age-Friendly University Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Hold on 1 minute. If it's possible for you to give a real quick answer, would you say there's a country in the world that is better on this subject?
Well, it's really an interesting question, because I have to say that from my perspective in adult education, lifelong learning, we have looked to Scandinavia a lot. And perhaps we have done so indiscriminately by looking at, not looking sufficiently at the differences between what they're doing in Denmark, what you're doing in Sweden, Norway and Finland.
Thank you, love that.